Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Tyne-Wear Archives and Museums to Created, our subject specialist training series for teachers. And a big welcome back to those of you who joined us last week for our Roman session. I hope you enjoyed it. So in our session today, we'll be looking at Bright Sparks, Shipbuilders and the Story of the Tyne. It's our second history event. We're going to follow the key moments from the 16th century to the modern day. I'm Charlotte and I'm the CPD manager for our cultural learning team here at Tyne-Wear Archives and Museums. And for those of you who don't know us, our mission is to welcome and connect to the people to the past, present and future of the Northeast through stories, shared spaces and experiences. And our team, the Regional Cultural Learning Team and the Learning Team, we connect the cultural and education sectors together so that children and young people have access to a really, really rich pot of cultural education. So now I'd like to introduce and hand over to our facilitators for this morning. We've got, today I'm going to support, and we've got Jack Hayes as well, who is our digital stage manager for the session. So if you've got any tech issues, just drop him a line in the chat. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for this afternoon's talks. We've got Andrew Fox, our creative producer and primary curriculum expert, who's going to do the first part. We've got Thomas Elwick, Learning Officer for Discovery Museum and the Tyne-Wear Archives, who's going to come in just after the break and tell you a little bit about what's on offer for schools in Discovery Museum and the archives. And finally, we will have our guest speaker, David Simpson, join us. David is the owner of England's Northeast website. He's a writer, a journalist, broadcaster and historian, and have strong roots in the Northeast. So we're really pleased to have him here today. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Andrew so we can start our journey back to the 16th century.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Fox. I'm leading the next created sessions for Tyne-Wear Archives and Museums, and each of which is inspired by the collections across the T1 sites. I've designed sessions to support you with using the collections as content and impetus for your subject curriculum teaching, and hopefully it will make it easier for you to see where you can connect into the different themes across the museums and archives. As Charlotte's just mentioned, we've got special guests to help us along the way, and I'll just add a little bit to the housekeeping. If any of you were on the last event, you'll know that there's audio visual content in my section for your pleasure. So if you have headphones, I would recommend popping those in for the best experience and hitting the full screen function to get the largest viewing size. You'll all be receiving a full PDF, as Charlotte says, so don't worry too much about taking down notes, because I know what you're like, teachers. You can flick through it all in your own time later. Okay, so we will start with just a brief overview about local history and the curriculum, and then we'll crack on with the story of the Tyne. My section is going to be about an hour and 15, hour and 20, and then T1 learning team, actually no, they're going to come in after the break. We've swapped that around, so we're going to take a 15-minute break after me, stretch your legs, and then learning team are going to come and say a few words about what's going on and how you can connect, and then we're going to be joined by David, as Charlotte was saying, afterwards. And to complement my section, David's going to be focusing on the important inventors and significant people throughout the history of the Tyne. So all in all, there'll be something for everybody this afternoon, no matter what stage of your career you are in. And I think it will probably be the biggest intake of cultural capital any one teacher can take in a sitting. So I'm not going to run through this because we went through this last time, but needless to say, all of this applies. So that slide's going to be in there as a refresher for colleagues that weren't on the first event. But there's lots of stuff that we can connect with the local history and learn in different ways about history, particularly with inquiry. Having all of this wonderful stuff on your doorstep, there's great potential for that. And I just want to talk briefly about the importance of the local area and the history curriculum, and in fact the curriculum as a whole. So local history, it gives us real rich opportunities to engage the children in their immediate surroundings, And that helps them to understand their history and how history contributes to the bigger picture. And in doing that, we're teaching about historical periods and timescales. We're learning about different peoples, groups and places, societies and experiences. We're understanding the narrative and chronology. We talked about chronology on the last event, particularly of British history post 1066. Exploring how society has changed within living memory. That's an important part of the history curriculum. Learning how to work with local artifacts and objects, buildings, census, trade, and this is where the wonderful resources at the museums and archives come in handy. And it's worthwhile saying I spend a lot of time in schools doing subject and curriculum reviews, and I always make sure I spend time in early years. And local history is an important bridge and a first critical knowledge layer coming from understanding the world into the Key Stage 1 history. So with all the subjects in your curriculum, I could take you down to early years and we could look for those very first things that the children need to be learning in, say, art or DT and in history. And I think local history plays a big part in that. And of course, we're developing cultural awareness and a sense of identity in the children as we go, and are connecting them with past communities of people. And all of this helps children to understand their place in the world. So there is a huge amount of value in working with your local area in regards to your history curriculum. And Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums can help you do so. Right then, let's bust a groove and get going. So we're going to pick up our story from the last session, and for those of you that weren't there, we left with the downfall of the Western Roman Empire, and Britain was gradually becoming untangled from Roman rule in around about 410 AD. And as we learnt last time, after the Roman departure, the power vacuum was quickly filled, and Newcastle became part of the powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria. And it became known as Monkchester throughout that period. But let's just fill in before we continue our story. So the key events in Britain after the Romans left, and just like last time, we were able to see how the cause and effect leads to one development into the next that shapes the history of Britain and indeed the towns, in particular, such as Newcastle. So after the Romans left came the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, and they arrived in 449 AD, led by the Germanic brothers Hengist and Horsa. And in 465, the Battle of Whippets Flute happened between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons. And if I pronounce that battle wrong, David can correct me later. I did struggle with that. But it's said that that battle resulted in much bloodshed and slaughter on both sides, and it was that bad that it led to a period of standoff between the two sides so that they could recover. And in 597, Saint Augustine arrived in Anglo-Saxon Canterbury, and he was sent here by Pope Gregory the Great to re-establish Christianity in England, and he came accompanied by a big gang of monks, which is a much more friendly and less threatening way of approaching Britain compared to Claudius with his elephants and his soldiers and whatnot. In 793, the Vikings delivered their devastating attack on the Church of St Cuthbert at Lindisfarne, and in 843 AD, the northern tribes that we were talking about on the last event that gave the Romans such a headache suddenly came together under Kenneth MacAlpine, and they united under one crown, giving birth to the Kingdom of Scotland. So important stuff happening here. In 1878, the Wessex army under King Alfred defeated Guthrum, the Viking king, and his great heathen army. And then finally in 895 AD, King Alfred's navy fought and defeated some invading armies of Danes. And if you were unfortunate enough to have been captured by King Alfred, you'd be taken to Winchester and hung as a pirate, no less. So after the war and conflict with the Danes, by 876 AD, the settlements along the Tyne were pretty much left in ruins, and further wars basically destroyed Montchester, and a lot of that to do was with the Norman conquest and Odo of Bayeux. And Odo of Bayeux was the Bishop of Bayeux in Normandy, and he was also made Earl of Kent in England following the Norman conquest. And he was the maternal half-brother of William the Conqueror, and was for a time quite an important administrator next to William in the Kingdom of England. But the site was revived, probably because of its strategic position, by Robert Curthose, who was actually the son of William the Conqueror, and he decided to erect a Motte and Bailey wooden castle in the site of Montchester, and then from then onwards the town was known as Novum Castellum, or Newcastle. And the wooden structure was replaced by a stone castle, and during the reign of Henry II, and now we have the recognisable Newcastle Keep. Still stands. So as Newcastle began to grow, so did its then early, if you like, infrastructure and fortification, which was keeping up with its strategic importance for both trade and defence. Following a fire in 1248, the old medieval bridge was replaced by the old Tyne Bridge, and that's thought to have been built around 1250 AD. And during the 13th and 14th centuries, the Newcastle town wall was built to protect the town from attack and occupation, namely the Scots. Henry I also established the Hospital of St Mary Magdalene to cater for people that had leprosy, and that was a disease that was being brought into the country at that time by the people coming back from the Crusades. And the hospital was located near what is now the northern end of Northumberland Street, and in 1291 it received an official licence to operate from King Edward I. Then Newcastle Cathedral, or the Church of St Nicholas, that was originally founded in 1091 during the same period as the nearby castle, but the Norman church was destroyed by a fire in 1216, and the current building was completed in 1350. It was during the Middle Ages that Newcastle began to flourish as a frontrunner in the wool trade, and wool was a key trading commodity during medieval times. In the early 14th century, Newcastle was ranked 6th in English wool exports, so that's pretty good going. And during the early years of the 13th century, orders of friars began to establish themselves in England. And Newcastle upon Tyne eventually had 5 friaries within its walls, starting with Blackfriars, which was established in 1239. And I believe that you can still go there and eat yummy food, which would be a nice thing to do. Now, as you may already know, and I've already just alluded to, there were quite a lot of wars with the Scots over history, and these are referred to as the Anglo-Scottish Wars, which comprise of the various battles that were fought between England and Scotland from the Wars of Independence in the early 14th century through to the latter years of the 16th century. And throughout the Middle Ages, Newcastle was very much England's northern frontier and fortress, and it played an important role in the border wars against Scotland, as it did with the Romans. And the city successfully defended itself against the Scots 3 times during the 14th century. And then in 1400, Newcastle established itself as a major centre and was made a county of itself by Henry IV, and it effectively became a self-governing county-empowered entity. Around about 1200 AD, jetties were starting to project into the River Tyne, and that's an early kind of indication that trade was starting to build and increase in Newcastle. And as the Roman roads continued to deteriorate, sea travel started to gain importance, and this saw medieval Newcastle start to really make use of its strategic position and natural resources. And by the 14th and 15th centuries, they were trading in all sorts of stuff like hide and coal and fish and whatnot. And with the commercial success, there always comes opportunists, don't there? And from the mid-13th century, when coal began to be exported from the River Tyne, the burgesses of Newcastle began to gain a monopoly over export. And in 1216, King John granted Newcastle the right to elect a mayor and also to form trade guilds. And these guilds sought to ensure that the trade in various commodities were focused and concentrated in Newcastle. And their monopoly and influence continued to build over the 14th and 15th century, and obviously later evolved into the hostmen in the early 16th century. So England underwent huge changes, as you may already know, during the reigns of the three generations of Tudor monarchs. And these changes affected all of the towns across the country, and that included Newcastle. Henry VIII ushered in a new state religion, and the increasing confidence of the state coincided with the growth of a distinctly burgeoning English type of culture. From 1530, a royal act was given that restricted all shipments of coal from Tyneside to Newcastle quayside, and that gave a monopoly in the coal trade to the cartel of Newcastle burgesses that became known as the hostmen. And this monopoly, which lasted for a considerable time, really helped Newcastle prosper and develop into a major town. An important set of workers in that picture for the hostmen were a close-knit community called the keelmen, and they were so called because they worked on the keel boats, and they used to transfer the coal from the riverbanks to the waiting colliers for export to London and elsewhere. And as in the 16th and 17th century, new industries began to emerge, and a glassworks appeared in 1619 in Byker, and in tandem with the coal mining industry came iron smelting works as well. And most of the iron at that time was made by heating iron ore in simple blast furnaces called bloomeries, and they would have used charcoal made from the woods of the extensive and I would imagine incredibly beautiful medieval forests of that time. So when the Stuarts arrived in 1603, they were the first kings of the United Kingdom, combining the two thrones of England and Scotland together for the first time. The Stuart dynasty reigned in England and Scotland from 1603 to 1714, and it saw a period of flourishing court culture, but there was also a lot of upheaval and instability across the kingdom. The bubonic plague had been terrorising Europe for centuries, and in 1636 it struck in North Shields and soon spread to Newcastle, sweeping through the town, killing many people and leaving the rest quaking in fear. It must have been terrible. And following this, in 1665, a devastating epidemic of the plague struck the entire country, killing many thousands of people. And it was the worst outbreak of the plague in England since the Black Death of 1348. And London lost roughly 15% of its population during that outbreak. The Stuarts' reign saw further developments in public life and governance, and that would reflect, I think, their love of high taste and court culture. And in 1655, the Guildhall was completed and opened, and its interior was apparently lavishly decorated with fine woodworks and paintings. But after a failed crop, the building was attacked by a crowd of 3,000 hungry and very angry local people in 1740. And in spite of the court pomp and splendour projected by the Stuarts, pretty much everyone in Newcastle at the time were living in poverty, and a lot of them relied on the coal business, and if that trade was poor, they really fell on hard times. And the English Civil War raged for 9 years, and Newcastle was very much embroiled in battles, as the North declared for the king, and numerous sieges and captures happened by the Scots, and there's a whole kind of side road you could go into there. But that, together with a completely despicable and dark side of justice, made life pretty tough for most Geordies at the time, and anyone falling on the wayside of public order faced pretty terrible and grisly torture methods. So during the 1600s and 1700s, there was all sorts of gruesome methods used to extract confessions from the supposedly guilty, and they included leg braces, thumb screws, the rack, sleep deprivation, and what appears to be an early version of waterboarding, where they pour water on rags and stuff it in there. So really, really nasty stuff. At the Tower of London, there was 3 main instruments of torture being used: the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and the manacles. And people around the country were also kind of copying what was happening in London, and Newcastle was no different, so it was pretty harsh. One more lighter torture method, if you can call it that way, specific to Newcastle, was the drunkard's cloak, which can be traced back to the 17th century, and that was basically a huge beer barrel that people were made to wear if they were found to be drunk and disorderly, and they were made to walk around the city with this on like a coat, and people would basically laugh at them, go, ha ha, you're a drunk. So that's not too bad compared to the rack and the manacles. But by far, one of the most monstrous and heinous practices of the time was the persecution of so-called witches at that time. And in 1650, 15 people, so 14 women and 1 man, were accused of shape-shifting into a black cat and killing children to summon demons. And they were taken to the town moor, and on the 21st of August 1650, they were all sentenced to death by hanging, and it marked it as one of the largest mass executions for witchcraft in the country. So as 1700 progressed into the Georgian era, Newcastle, like most cities, witnessed the onset of the Industrial Revolution, and steelworks joined the other industries on the time. In 1736, The assembly rooms were demolished and moved to a new site opposite the original in, quote, the pleasantest part of the town inhabited by the clergy and gentry, I say. On 16th and 17th of November in 1771, a tragic flood was set off by a combination of three things. There was a sudden thaw of ice in Upper Teesdale, a cloudburst over the Pennines, and a continual long period of rain, which kicked off the Great Flood. And in Newcastle, it affected several rivers, including the Tyne, the Tees, the Wear, and Eden, and it affected many settlements across the northern part of England. On the Old Tyne Bridge, the middle arch and the two of the arches near the Gateshead side collapsed in the early hours of November the 17th. And like many bridges of the time, there'd been houses and shops on there, so it was quite a tragic accident, and in total 25 people died in the Great Flood. The world at that time was becoming much bigger and wider, both in terms of trade, but also in human thought, religion and art, and in the written word. And two newspapers were founded during the 18th century, the 1700s, so the Newcastle Courant and the Chronicle. And in 1801, at the time of the first census, Newcastle upon Tyne had a population of 28,000, and it grew quite rapidly. And by 1831, it had gone up to 53,000. And the boundaries were extended in 1835 to include Byker, Westgate, Ellswick, Jesmond and Heaton. And then in 1851, the population of the borough had reached over 87,000. So quite a significant increase in population during the early 1800s. And in 1830, as you're probably aware, this is probably a popular fact, Charles Grey became Newcastle's first Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he served until 1834, and I believe he brought about some notable reforms, and of course he's commemorated by Grey's monument in the centre of Newcastle. And also the first passenger railway to use steam trains to transport passengers was launched by the Stockton and Darlington Railway Company, and that operated across the northeast of England from 1825 to 1863. And as the Victorian era came in, with further developments in industry, Newcastle needed more space to expand, and the once mighty town wall that was built as a defence against the Scots during the 13th and 14th centuries started to be dismantled to basically make room for an expanding and growing town. By 1836, Newcastle was one of Europe's biggest industrial towns, and it received its own first modern police force, which happened 3 years before the County Police Act of 1839. Tragedy struck again in the early hours of October the 6th in 1854, when an explosion occurred which shook Newcastle and Gateshead to its very foundations. So a fire broke out in Gateshead factory, in a factory in Gateshead, and that slowly spread, and it eventually reached a warehouse which contained explosive materials, and the heat caused the sulphur to ignite and produced a huge burning flame which set off a catastrophe. And many buildings along the quayside were destroyed, and it killed 53 people and injured hundreds more. And on Saturday, the 6th of October in 1894, what appears to be the first association football match was played at St James's Park when Exeter AFC took on Minehead. And apparently there weren't many spectators, very few, but Exeter began with 2 men short, and it was Campbell who scored the first goal, and Exeter won 3-0. The city status for Newcastle was granted on the 3rd of June in 1882. And in the 19th century, shipbuilding and heavy engineering were central to Newcastle's prosperity. And it really, Newcastle had become a powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution. And that resulted in a lot of urbanisation of the city. In the years between 1825 and 1840, the centre of Newcastle was rebuilt, thanks to the work of 3 men, Mr. John Dobson, Mr. Richard Granger, and Mr. John Clayton, who all have streets named after them. And in Granger, it's my favourite part of Newcastle, Granger Town. So you've got the Granger Market and the Theatre Royal, and it's regarded as Newcastle's finest buildings. And they're predominantly 4 stories with vertical dormers and domes and all of that paraphernalia. And the architecture is dubbed Tyneside Classical. And I think there's 450 buildings in Granger Town, of which 244 are now listed. That may have changed, that figure. Okay, so the next section, I thought we'd look at the different themes that are covered in the Working Lives collection at the Discovery Museum. And as we're doing that, we can still learn about and consider how the story of the Tyne unfolded. And it's basically a story of working people from 1700s through to the modern day. And that's something, of course, can be looked at as a whole for Britain. But there are undoubtedly specific jobs and occupations that are linked to the locality of a specific city or town, such as Newcastle. So before industrialisation, in the late 1700s, most people were working on the land, and they had to do that in all seasons and whatever the elements threw at them. The British Agricultural Revolution, which was a boom in farming, saw a big increase in agricultural production in Britain between the mid-17th and late 19th centuries. And this arose from increases in labour and people being more productive with land. And the history of industry quite often overshadows what happened with farming in the northeast. But prior to the Industrial Revolution, farming was the most important source of employment in the region. And it had been happening around the time since Neolithic times. And the Britons farmed, the Vikings farmed, and the Anglo-Saxons farmed as well. And then from about 1750, Acts of Parliament increased enclosures in upland areas, and then dry stone walls began to appear on the landscape. So coal mining needs no introduction in this section, and as we discussed earlier, it rose as one of the most important industries for Newcastle, and its production dominated industry on Tyneside by the early 1800s. And you can follow the entire story of coal mining on the Tyne up until the 20th century at the Discovery Museum. So the men and boys did stifling work in the underground pits, but up until 1842, women also worked underground, and so did children as young as 8. But Queen Victoria put an end to that following a disaster at a colliery near Barnsley in which 26 children were killed. And her inquiry resulted in the Mines and Collieries Act, which basically banned women and girls and boys under 10 from underground work. But the new law didn't prevent women and girls from working on the surface, and they did so by loading wagons, sorting coal, and on conveyor belts and hauling the heavy tubs up from the pit face. And they were dubbed the pit brow lasses. And as the demand for coal increased in the 19th and early 20th century, miners were forced to go even deeper underground to find new coal. And sometimes they worked for as long up to as 12 hours in a shift, which must have been exhausting. They were deep underground in tunnels, and the conditions were dark, hot, and really, really cramped. And following the disaster, the law was changed, and pits were required to have 2 exits for miners. Okay, in 1639, the first printing press was set up on the Tyne Bridge. And I found it quite interesting when I was reading about how that came about. It was brought about when England was threatened with a rebellion in Scotland, and measures were taken by the English government to prevent a general uprising of the Scottish people. And placing himself at the head of the army, King Charles came north in March 1639, and not long after his arrival it was discovered that for him to carry out his important businesses of the state so far away from London without the means of issuing royal decrees and proclamations quickly, that was quite a serious inconvenience. And so a printing press was established to serve that need, and that then the industry kind of went from there. And in the late 1700s and early 1800s, Newcastle was the country's largest print centre after London, Oxford and Cambridge, and there was an outpouring of books, newspapers, leaflets and posters from the many printing presses that were springing up. And the flourishing print trade had a big impact on the lives of people on the Tyne. So for those that couldn't read, there were pictures from portraits that they could look at, the celebs of the time. There's souvenirs of local sites, and there's also cartoons to keep the spirits high. And as I mentioned before, in 1710, the North's first newspaper rolled off the press, called the Newcastle Courant. And that predated the Chronicle by, I think, 20 years or so. So people were able to read, and they can now keep up with the news and learn about science and politics and religion and all things like that. And the new passion for reading in the North inspired heated debates in the newly formed Literary and Philosophical Society, which was established in 1793. And it kept people chatting in the libraries and coffee shops that were opening all over Newcastle. And I think one of the most interesting impacts of print and publishing on Tyneside is that it saw the amount of children going to school rise by 45% in 1853, which is staggering. So what an important impact that was.
Ground floor perfumery, stationery and leather goods, wigs and haberdashery, kitchenware and food going up. First floor telephones, gents ready-made suits, shirts, socks, ties, hats.
Morning, ladies. Now, I know at least 4 people in the room really wanted to hear and needed to hear that theme tune from Are You Being Served, including me. In the late 1800s, there was a big expansion of job opportunities for women, and thousands of girls and women took up jobs as nurses, as maids and waitresses and dressmakers and shop assistants. For most working class women in Victorian England, they didn't have much choice but to work in order to help to support their families, and other things they might have done, worked in factories, domestic service for richer households, family businesses, and in the markets and shops. But this is an opening and opportunity, and it presented many different roles, for the modern woman on the Tyne, and that gradually evolved into the contemporary world that we're in now of non-gender specific employment, and we're in an era now where women are able to take on any jobs that men do, and quite rightly so. And something that those Romans gifted to us, for better or for worse, is bureaucracy. And from the late 1800s, the amount of bureaucracy led to hundreds of men and women being involved in paper chasing and pen pushing in offices and public sector buildings in Newcastle, because at that time office culture was developing around the UK and the world. So in 1726, the old Admiralty office in London opened as the first purpose-built office, and in 1729 the East India Company started to use office space to manage their empire, their trading empire, remotely. And interestingly, in around about 1800, the first reports of office boredom and toxic company culture began to emerge, which I found quite fascinating. And that's just kind of like a hint about the sentiment that will follow in the modern world. But there's a great poem here I'm going to read to you by Mr. Thomas Love Peacock, who worked at the East India House, and the poem is called A Day at the India Office. From 12 to 1, think what's to be done. From 1 to 2, find nothing to do. From 2 to 3, think it will be. A very great bore to stay till 4. In 1840, the light bulb increases the length of the average working day, and in 1902, thanks to elevators, offices were preparing to become vertical, and by 1911 they'd started to resemble factories, and now we're kind of in that kind of modern day era of cubicle office spaces, email, and most frustratingly, work that now follows you home from the office. But before we move on, I think next time you open up your laptop, I want you to think about these incredible machines, which at the time were the last word in technology.
Good typists are always in demand, and so are typewriters, an English invention in the reign of Queen Anne. But the first commercial model was not made until 1873. (1878), and another model of the same basic design with upper and lower case letters, shift key, and other improvements on model number 1, which printed only in capitals. 5 years later, the Blickensderfer. A competitor of number 2, it illustrates the principle of typing by means of a type drum instead of separate bars. Cheaper to make, they were, however, slow and heavy in action. It's a bit of a jump to the next one on view. This has keyboard margin control, key trip lever for jammed keys, individual touch control, and many other refinements. And now for the last word in typewriters, the first all-electric model. Attached to an ordinary lighting circuit, it consumes no more current than an ordinary radio set. As for speed, there is practically no limit. It reduces fatigue and marks a tremendous step forward in business efficiency.
Touché, let's move on. So we can't talk about working lives in Newcastle without mentioning shipbuilding industry, of course, because it was linked to coal mining, for which the city became famous. A shipwriters guild was founded in early 17th century, but the Industrial Revolution brought a lot of new challenges that local shipbuilders and engineers on the Tyne really rose to and responded to. The first steam paddle boat, the Tyne Steam Packet, was launched on the 21st of February 1814, and that was used to carry passengers between Newcastle and the coast. Iron shipbuilding was pioneered on the Tyne, and it included steamers, tugs and colliers, and they were the ships that transported the coal. And after Stephenson invented the first steam train, transporting coal over land became quicker and cheaper, and unfortunately for the Newcastle coal merchants, this meant that they found it harder to compete with coal mines in the English Midlands and Yorkshire, because they could transport their goods to London by rail. But in 1852, the John Bow ship was launched, and the subsequent ships in that model revolutionised the coal transport, because they could make the return journey from Newcastle to London within 5 days, whereas previously it had taken a month. So that's jolly useful. And generally throughout the period, the engineers and shipbuilders from the Tyne were leading the way in terms of innovation. But in the early 20th century, yard closures brought large-scale unemployment, When the famous Palmer's Yard in Jarrow was closed in 1933, I think more than 7,000 people were unemployed. That's 70% of the town's workforce. And there were so many unemployed people that 200 workers from Jarrow decided to march to London to raise awareness and public sympathy in the hope that the government would intervene.
Led by red-haired and indefatigable Miss Ellen Wilkinson MP, Jarrow unemployed who marched to London have already secured some assistance for their specially distressed area. We rejoice with them. We hope their prosperity may be on the way.
So the Jarrow March wasn't really successful in terms of influencing the government, but fate would have it that in the 1930s rearmament started to happen, and people were quickly realising that war was looming and they were going to need ships. So the shipyards became busy again. And then after the Shipbuilding Inquiry Committee report in 1966, all the main Tyne shipbuilders are amalgamated into the Swan Hunter Group, which was nationalised as part of British shipbuilding in 1977. But the yards gradually started to close, and by the end of the 1980s, it was only the Wallsend Swan Hunter Yard that remained. And whereas 50 years ago shipbuilding and ship repair and marine engineering firms dominated the edge of the Tyne, now little remains. And you can follow the story of shipbuilding at the Discovery Museum in a great exhibition and find out about the different types of boats through some fantastic models. I love the models. And it also tells you about the development of the piers and the fishing industry, and also the swing bridge, which was first used for road traffic on the 15th of June 1876 and then opened for river traffic on the 17th of July in 1876. But by far the most impressive exhibit, for me anyway, at the Discovery Museum is Turbinia, and you can't miss her. It's the first thing you see as you go in on your left. So Turbinia was the first steam-powered steamship that was built as an experimental vessel in 1894, and at the time she was easily the fastest ship around. And Turbinia set the standard for a generation of steamships, the majority of which would have this turbine power. And that was designed by Sir Charles Parsons, who designed the modern steam turbine engine that was to power these ships. And the steam turbine made cheap and plentiful electricity possible, and that then went on to revolutionise marine transport and also naval warfare, as we're going to find out. But it also earned him several awards, and he created various models and prototypes of Turbinia before launching her into the sea. And a model of one is at the museum. So that did the trick, and the Admiralty were convinced. There followed after Turbinia two prototype turbine-powered destroyers for the Navy, HMS Viper and Cobra, but both those vessels were sadly lost. And then the first turbine-powered merchant vessel, the steamer, the T.S. King Edward, came in 1901. And the Admiralty confirmed in 1905, which I'm sure was to Charles's pleasure, that all future Royal Naval vessels were to be turbine powered. And in 1906, the first turbine powered battleship, the HMS Dreadnought, was launched. Sadly, Turbinia was involved in a collision with a ship called the Crosby, but she was repaired, and she steamed alongside RMS Mauretania, who was also a turbine powered vessel at her launch, but unfortunately due to mechanical problems, Turbinia had to turn back, so couldn't accompany Mauretania all the way down the Tyne to the sea. But Turbinia's legacy was complete, and her design led to the first steam turbine battleships and passenger vessels, and it ultimately led on to the invention of the jet engine, which began as a gas-powered version of Parsons' invention. So there's some cause and consequence for you. But another magical ship story to look at is the Mauretania. And as I just mentioned, the Mauretania was an ocean liner that was powered by Parsons' new technology. And she was designed by Leonard Peskett and built by Swan Hunter on the River Tyne for the British firm Cunard Line. And she was the world's largest ship up until the launch of the RMS Olympic in 1910. In 1906, Mauretania was launched with her sister ship, Lusitania, and at the time of the launch, she was officially the largest moving structure ever built, just a bit bigger than Lusitania and larger in gross tonnage. Mauretania had a nickname, the Grand Old Lady of the Atlantic, and she preceded the Titanic, but was almost certainly a forerunner and an inspiration for Titanic. And she even gets a mention at the beginning of James Cameron's film Titanic, when Rose says that Titanic does not appear larger than Mauretania, but her snobbish fiance then gets back to her and says, yes, Titanic is much larger and much more luxurious than Mauretania. So Mauretania was very much a trailblazer in those big, beautiful liners of the time. And during the First World War, she worked as a hospital ship, but most of her life she sailed gracefully across the Atlantic as a luxury passenger ship, taking paying guests between America and Great Britain. So let's have a look around on Mauretania. the wonderful and deeply charming Mauritania. Perhaps you could turn your classroom or school hall into the Mauritania ballroom for a spot of dancing, and I think there'd be a menu to prepare and some postcards and letters to write home. Anyway, if anyone spotted my deliberate homage to Stanley Kubrick there, top marks. You get to drink bourbon with me and Jack Torrance at the Overlook Bar this evening. And another fantastic story you can explore with the children, linked to World War II, is the capture of the Enigma documents, and all of that is linked to the Tyne shipbuilding. So Operation Primrose was a top secret mission led by the Allies to capture Enigma associated things from the German U-boat U-110. And of course, you probably already know that the Enigma machine was a famous encryption machine used by the Germans in the war, Second World War, to transmit coded messages. And it was very clever at allowing for billions and billions of ways to encode a message. And U-110 was captured by the Royal Navy on the 9th of May 1941. And that capture was led by HMS Bulldog, which was built by Swan and Hunter on Tyneside. And then the next part of that story involves a young 15-year-old Geordie lad from North Shields called Thomas Brown, and he was a NAFI canteen assistant aboard the HMS Petard, who that was also built in Tyneside as well. Petard was set about chasing another German U-boat along with 3 other destroyers. They spent 16 hours hunting U-559 in the Mediterranean, and they subjected the submarine to a gruesome 10-hour depth charge attack. That must have been frightening for the people in the U-boat. Anyway, that forced the Germans to abandon the U-boat, and a boarding party was prepared aboard HMS Petard, and that included Thomas Brown, First Lieutenant Anthony Fasson, and able seaman Colin Grazier. And they dived into the water and swam to the sinking U-boat. They climbed into the submarine's control room and scooped up the Enigma documents, and they were passed to Thomas, who made 3 trips back to keep the documents safe and get them safely onto the destroyer. But then suddenly, tragically, the submarine started to sink, and Fasson and Grazier were lost. And the documents were pretty, whisked off really quickly to the code breakers at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, and they were crucial in helping to crack the Enigma system. And Thomas Brown's U-boat bravery earned him the George Medal, along with his colleagues. But sadly, it's a sad end to the story. While on leave in 1945, he was killed in a house fire back in North Shields at home, which is a terribly tragic end for such a brave person. But unknown to Brown, the documents that he'd retrieved were just really valuable in breaking the Enigma code, and it allowed the code breakers to attack the Triton key, which was used by the U-boats that up to that point had been invulnerable. And Allied convoys in the Atlantic could now be directed away from U-boat locations. And Winston Churchill wrote that the actions of the crew were crucial and critical to the outcome of the war. So that's how important that piece of bravery was. And aboard the ships made in the Tyne. So there's a lovely, really interesting, deep story to tell there, linked to World War II. And Thomas Brown never knew the contents of the documents of what he was actually rescuing, because information relating to Enigma wasn't released until decades after his death, so he didn't even know what he was risking his life for. Okay, so we're going to finish up by briefly looking at a few highlights of the 20th century, of which there are many in the Tyne and Newcastle. And I'm sure you can appreciate that trying to fit everything into an hour and a bit is just impossible. But considering the aims of teaching the history of living memory over the last 100 years, then we'll just have a quick look at some of the major themes, and then you can zoom in and explore the 20th and 21st century at your pleasure. And in your own time in the museum. So needless to say, just as we've been learning about Thomas Brown and Operation Primrose, there's a wealth of stuff to learn and link into your study of the World Wars, particularly World War II. You can look at World War I by studying how the women worked in the munitions factory in Elswick. And during the Second World War, just like my hometown in Coventry, the city and the surrounding area of Newcastle was targeted due to its heavy industry output, and the raids there caused 141 deaths in Newcastle and the surrounding area, many injuries. And apparently you were sold out by a former French consul in Newcastle called Jacques Serre. And he apparently assisted the German war effort by describing important targets in the region to the admiral and head of the German Navy. So that's a bit dastardly and devious. But Newcastle Corporation tramways opened from 1901, and then these were gradually replaced by the trolleybus system in 1935. So there's a whole kind of story about transport there. In 1920s, the council housing began to be replace inner city slums, and that process continued into the 1970s, along with programs of substantial private house building. The Tyne Bridge was officially opened on the 10th of October 1928 by King George V. And obviously that's a defining symbol for Tyneside. A nice bit of DT learning there. What kind of bridge is it, colleagues? And the Great Depression that was happening around the world came to the United Kingdom. It was known as the Great Slump, and it was a period of national economic downturn in the 1930s, which had its origins in the wider global depression. But it was Britain's largest and most profound economic depression of the 20th century. So some tough times again there. But immigration boomed during the 20th century in Newcastle, with people arriving from all over the globe. And there's a nice collection at Discovery which focuses on some different characters, tells the story of how they arrived at different points in the 20th century into Newcastle. And then sadly, overseas competition in industry during the 60s, 70s and 80s, as we mentioned before with the shipbuilding, led to decline and closure, and some of that was to do with political decisions, but it really affected the northeast, and the community suffered as a result, leading to long-term unemployment. And I just want to end, if you haven't already come across the local photographer Tish Murtha, then please do check out her work. We're going to look at some of her images to finish now. And if your school aren't looking at Tish Murtha as part of your art curriculum, then see me after class. Right, it's about time we took a breather. Before we do, I just wanted to point out, which I think I already said, that everything that we've looked at was inspired by my visit to the Discovery Museum, and also the fantastic England's North East website, of which David is the owner and curator, and that is a fantastic resource for anyone wanting to learn more about the local history in the North East and on Tyneside. I hope you've had a chance to rest your eyes and brains and you're refreshed. So before I hand over to David Simpson, the learning team from Discovery Museum are here, I believe. So I'm going to hand over to them and they're going to talk to you for 5 minutes about what's happening at the Discovery Museum.
Hello there. My name's Tom Elwick. I'm the learning officer at Discovery Museum. I only have 5 minutes, so I'll just do a quick rundown of the place I work. Am I channeling my inner Chris Whitty? And Jack, will you move them along for me?
Yeah, if you just ask me when to move on, I'll do that.
Excellent. Okay. So I've been learning officer at Discovery Museum for the past 18 years or so. No, I've been a member of the learning team with Tyne-and-Wear Archives and Museums for the past 18 years. I've been with Discovery Museum as a learning officer for the past 8 years or so, although I am losing track now. This is the amazing building that I work. Hopefully many of you have had a chance to visit us and take part in a range of different things. Next slide, please. My job is I'm responsible for the programs that exist at Discovery Museum. So the formal and informal programs. I have a team of 2 assistant learning officers. I'm also responsible for the Tyne-and-Wear Archives and Museums Museum Loan Service as well, known as Boxes of Delight. And so I have a team of 4 members of staff that I manage, and we do a range of things. So informal stuff that we do, and I don't know whether you all want to know about the informal stuff. Is it the formal school-related stuff you're more keen on? We have over last year delivered a range of different things. So you can see we've got things such as Professor Pumpernickel, who delivered science shows for us last year. He was a scientist rock star, you could say. We've had bubbleologist Jessie, who delivers things during the summer. We've run silent discos, especially during Halloween. We've worked with under 5s doing under 5 discos up in our Great Hall as well. We've worked with circus performers, Circurama, and we also in May, back end of April, run something called the Brick Show with a large Lego group known as Brick Alley and so on. So there's lots of different things happen at Discovery. This is just a snapshot of the informal activities that we do during half terms, Easters, Christmas, summers, and so forth. But what you might want to know more about is the learning program that we offer. And we work with a wide range of different groups. Our schools program is predominantly Key Stage 1 and 2. We have our Great Fire week that we run in October. We run a special week in December to do with World War II. In June, we always run a huge, massive carousel of science activities around our building. And we also will deliver activities for home educators groups as well. We recently have had a lot of home educators clubbing together and basically booking onto the wide range of different workshops that we provide. And these are from STEM sessions to history sessions. We have an under 5s learning program that we run as well, called Tiny Sparks, which happens up in our science maze space, which happens most Wednesdays, usually during term time. And it's a growing under 5s offer, and we love it. We also run at key points throughout the year, toddler takeovers as well. We've got one coming up this March too. During the summers as well, we do science summer clubs, and we also work with young youth organisations such as Scouts and Guides, where we put on our uniform group days in the November time, although last year it was back in December. Everybody takes part to get a badge too. Other holiday programmes we do, Discovery Days, we run under 5 Discover a Story sessions, we're running family challenges. We're having a bit of a tweak this year, so we're definitely going to be doing lots of story sessions and family challenges, but we're not going to do as many crafts as we used to. But we are still going to be doing lots of different specialist events, and we do have lots of trails at different points throughout the year, Easter being one of our most popular ones. And these are just a few images of some of the things that we do. The Great Hall, you can see a picture. This is a picture from the Lego event. You can see the amazing space that we use. We've just been using that today. We've been doing an event with the West End Schools Trust called STEMtastic. We've had a carousel of STEM activity running upstairs. We actually offer bespoke sessions for schools if they're interested. So if you go onto our website, you can actually look at all the different workshops that we have on offer. But we also, if you were to bring us and speak to us, we have bespoke opportunities. So we can actually do discovery days, which will take up the entire Great Hall and put on a series of activities, or we can tailor some of our workshops to the needs of the schools that are there. Some of the other images that you see, some of them are from our uniform group day, some of them from our science summer clubs, but we can do things such as we did marble runs recently. It's one of our family challenges. We've even can do catapult challenges with groups as well. But you don't have to do workshops with us. You can actually just visit us self-led, and we do encourage all of our schools to come. Just so you know, we've actually been really, really busy this past half term and coming up to the next half term. We're fully booked. So after this half term, we will have more bookings available for the summer term for our school workshops. But if you can't get booked onto a workshop due to the demand that we have, we do recommend schools coming to visit us on a self-led basis. And you can explore all the different galleries that we have in the museum. So the first gallery you'll see is the Tabinia Gallery, the first space you come into when you first walk into the museum, seeing the amazing ship invented by Charles Parsons. Then you can go into Newcastle Story, and you can stroll through reconstructions of different time periods from Roman day all the way up to as close to present day as you can. We're about 20 years out at the minute. And then you can also visit our temporary exhibition space. Currently, we have an exhibition called Powering the Past, which explores the Victorian period and the Industrial Revolution, and also the way in which we have used fossil fuels and so forth in our area. This is also going to then move into another exhibition in July, which is called Steam to Green, which is all about the industries that exist in Tyneside today and how they're going to improve our area, improve the world really, to do with climate change. So things like companies such as Vattenfall and Dogger Bank and the Equin and things like that. We've got things to do with wind turbines and Nissan and gigafactories. So there's quite a bit of different, we've got lots of partners working with us to actually bring objects that are relevant now, so we can compare and contrast the Victorian Industrial Revolution up to, you could say, the revolution of technologies that are going to combat climate. Then you can also move to other galleries as well. If you want to find out about how the River Tyne has shaped Newcastle and the industries that exist there, you can go visit our Story of the Tyne Gallery, especially visit a map built in 1929, which details the River Tyne and all of the little details that are there, just of the different industries and businesses. They've got coal staves on there, and you've also got all of the shipbuilding that was there too. And you can find little Easter eggs hidden away of different ships that have been built on the River Tyne. We've got things like the Carpathia in Mauritania and even the Tabinia on that map too. You can visit Working Lives, which looks at the 200 years of the different industries that have existed in Tyneside. And then you can go to my favourite gallery, which is Tyneside Challenge, which has the Armstrong Whitworth car in there, a very old vehicle, which originally belonged to the first ever curator of the Science and Industry Museum, which is the museum that came before Discovery Museum first was renamed. And Tyneside Challenge has all of the different problems that Tyneside ingenuity has solved. People like Joseph Swan from Gateshead and how he invented the light bulb, for example. And you can also visit Charge, England's Northern Cavalry, which is a gallery dedicated to the Queen's Own Yeomanry and the Northumberland Hussars, otherwise known as the Light Dragoons. And you can see lots of different things in that space too. To finish off, you can visit Destination Tyneside, which is our gallery dedicated to migration to our area. So you can find out about the different communities in Tyneside and where people have, when people have settled in Newcastle and Tyneside, where they've originally come from, and there's a whole series of stories that you can explore, and the history of it. 6 individual people from different parts of the world. I think Yemen, Italy, we've got also Ireland, and so on. So there are lots of different things with objects that you can explore too. Then the most interactive place of Discovery Museum is our science maze, with little under 5 space called mini maze, a little bit soft play and toys to play with, and then lots and lots of different interactive spaces with 4 key areas. We've got forces, electricity and magnetism, we've got sound, and then we've got light. And we've also got a bulb wall, which has bulbs that have been built and made in our area, including a number that were made by Joseph Swan. And if you wanted to, you can also take a visit to our shadow wall as well, and leave your mark on that wall for a short period of time after a flash of light. To finish off, we also have our play and event space, which is a second learning space that we have in the building. We also have a learning room downstairs, which we do a lot of our workshops in as well. And we do a lot of our holiday activities and some of our school workshops in there as well, including also our Tiny Sparks offer for under 5s too. And to finish off, you could actually come to an event up in the Great Hall. So it could be one of our science events, or it could be one of our discovery days, or it could even be one of our holiday activities, such as the storytelling or our uniform group day, for example. Our holiday offer is across Tyneborough Archives and Museums is marketed as ways to play. So there's lots of different types of activities which you can do, which you might be able to make, party, explore, create, collage or design your way in different themes related to the different types of activities that we will be delivering throughout the year. And that's everything. So it's a pleasure talking to you all. If you haven't visited Discovery Museum before, I would highly recommend you please come to us. If you have already visited us, you already know the amazing collections that we hold and the types of the periods in history and the science that we can help teach your students and young people. But if you've got any queries or questions, all you need to do is contact us at learning@discoverymuseum.org.uk, and you'll get a member of my team, and they'll be able to answer many of your questions. Or you can visit Discovery Museum's website, go to discoverymuseum.org.uk/learning, and then you can see everything that we have on offer, from our history workshops to our STEM workshops. But the biggest thing I would also recommend is just give us a call or an email. And if you don't think there's something that's there that fits, just ask, because quite often we can adapt and adjust our sessions, or even we might have a big wealth of past activity that we've delivered that we can actually draw from to help you visit your, support your school or young people in whatever kind of visit they want. So just give us a call. Other than that, thank you very much.
Right, without further ado, David, are you there?
I am here. Hello.
Hello, David. It's brilliant to have you with us, and
Thank you.
I'm going to hand over to you now, and you can continue with our story of the Tyne. So over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Andrew. There's some great presentations there, some interesting activities there at the Discovery Museum, but I really enjoyed your presentation, Andrew. So just to talk about myself very quickly, my name's David Simpson, and I run the England's North East website, englandsnortheast.co.uk. There's lots of features on that website which I think people will find useful. It includes a timeline, for example, an extensive timeline, which covers several pages looking at themes of North East history from prehistoric times to the modern age. There is a section on famous people, which we will sort of be touching on today. And that's a sort of a directory, sort of a potted biographies of famous people from throughout the region in the past. And that's something that I'm constantly developing. And there's also lots of extensive histories of lots of different areas of the North East, from the south of the region up to Berwick. So without further ado, I thought I would start by giving a brief introduction. I'll talk about the geography, early history, and the challenges of industry that created the setting and environment in which the bright sparks of Tyneside's invention and industry would thrive. So curiosity, creativity, invention and innovation has long been a characteristic of Northeastern people. We could go back to the time of the Venerable Bede, the scholar and monk of Jarrow. Now, that was a place which, along with its twin monastery at Wearmouth, just down the road, hosted one of the great libraries of learning in Europe in its time. It really was a centre of learning. Now, Bede had an acute understanding of classical sciences, and he played a key role in imparting that knowledge, most notably through his work, The Reckoning of Time. Now, he had an understanding of mathematical calculations, a familiarity with the relationship of the moon to the tide, and he knew full well that the earth was not flat. Now, the nature of things and how that nature could be exploited for the furtherance of human knowledge and development and progress towards our modern age has long been a continuous aspect of our region's history. The way in which people have responded to the landscape, geography, and geology of our region has shaped the history of the Northeast quite profoundly. Geology has both created problems and provided solutions to human needs, whether that be the defensive castles or the forts of Hadrian's Wall, which were built on the Great Windsill, a very imposing geological structure, or by the challenges of extracting coal and lead and iron ore from the geological strata of the region. But above all, it was that great geological resource of coal that shaped the region's history like no other. Now, I've used the term geology there a few times. It's not always everyone's favourite subject, but the term geology, incidentally, was first coined in 1333 as geologia in a work entitled Philobiblon. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And it was written and compiled at Durham by Richard Bury, a Bishop of Durham, in his description of earthly sciences. Now, this interest in nature of things has extended into modern times. We could mention Sir Harold Jeffreys, who lived from 1891 to 1989. He was born in the Northeast and educated at Armstrong College in Newcastle, where a plaque at what is now Newcastle University notes that he was the discoverer of the internal structure of the Earth. He realised that the centre of the Earth was fluid, which wasn't known up until that point. We might also mention the Nobel Prize-winning Peter Higgs, born at Elsick in 1929, and the discoverer of the nature of nature itself. He discovered and proposed the Higgs boson particle, which was finally proven by the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva in 2013. Quite an extraordinary discovery. It's a particle without which there would be no matter, no mass, and no atoms. So that was really quite an extraordinary discovery. Now, geographically, the rivers, and especially the River Tyne, provided an initial solution to the transportation and shipment of coal, which has driven the Northeast economy for centuries. The need for this transportation demanded better and faster ships and later railroads and steam locomotives. Shipbuilding was present on the River Tyne, the River Wear and Tees from medieval times. And in the 1700s, Daniel Defoe, that famous author of Robinson Crusoe, visiting Newcastle, where he would reside for some time just across the river at Gateshead, he noted that they build ships here to perfection. In the later part of that same century, it was noted that some enterprising and professional shipbuilders down the road at Sunderland would resort to making ships rather than building them. They made them in their spare time. The distinction being that they were built on the cheap, so just made rather than built at a sort of a lower price, but without the guarantee of quality. And this became a subject of a jibe, which is first mentioned in the 1850s by a Durham historian writing half a century later. Of course, we're talking about wooden sailing ships in this early period of history. Now, the earthly science of exploiting coal in the region can be traced back to Roman times, and early records of coal shipment from Newcastle include a delivery of coal to Corfe Castle in Dorset in 1291. However, at that time, Newcastle was better known for the export of leather, And Andrew's already mentioned the wool trade, but Newcastle was actually the leading port for the export of leather at that time. In 1538, Newcastle had become so synonymous with coal that the term coals for Newcastle for a pointless, fruitless enterprise was used for the first time. Sadly, the identities of individuals and innovations at the basic ground level throughout this period are largely anonymous, except for the names of the powerful burgesses and merchants who controlled and dominated the coal trade. And we've already mentioned the hostmen that succeeded them. Now, in the 1600s, wooden wagonways or railroads, which were the world's first railways, began to emerge in the region, and these were known as Newcastle roads. They facilitated the transportation of coal from the mines to the rivers Tyne and Wear, using horse-drawn wagons called chaldrons. One of the earliest recorded wagonways in the Wickham Grand Lease Railway is the Wickham Grand Lease Railway of 1620, which transported coal from Wickham to the River Tyne at Dunston. Another slightly later wagonway was what we now call the Tanfield Railway, just to the southwest of Gateshead, dating from the 1720s. A remnant of this is the Causey Arch of 1727, which crosses a nearby stream. It is the world's oldest surviving railway bridge. So who were the great railway pioneers? Well, first we should say that one of the problems posed by geology was the need to pump the subterranean water from the mines to prevent flooding. In 1711, Thomas Newcomen invented an engine for pumping water out of coal mines. Now, he was born in Dartmouth, so Newcomen we can't claim for our region, but his engines were widely used in the northeast coal mines, and they placed a technology here in the region that would stimulate and challenge the minds of clever and inquiring solution-seeking men. William Brown, a mining engineer at Leamington on Tyneside, had erected 88 of these pumping engines across our region by 1769. And in 1753, Michael Menzies, a Wearsider, invented an engine which he called a Menzie, and that was used for hauling the coal from the mines. Of course, the Scotsman James Watt, who is widely credited with the steam engine, also made innovative developments and improvements to steam engines. And in 1782, these were partly used in mines at Benwell and Walker on Tyneside. The transition to steam locomotives was a natural one. Stationary engines provided a solution for hauling coal wagons by cables and ropes up steep hills, as well as lowering them down. These hills were just too steep for the horse-drawn work. It was natural that someone would propose fitting wheels to engines to haul wagons along wagonways. It was a Cornishman, Richard Trevithick, rather than a Tynesider, that takes credit for this, although his locomotive was primitive compared to its successors. However, some of the biggest names in the development of locomotives were Tyneside men. Two of these Tynesiders were Matthew Merry, I think we have a picture of him, and John Blenkinsop. They're not so well known in our region, perhaps because they made their names at Middleton Colliery near Leeds in Yorkshire, which belonged to the Brandling family of Felling on Tyneside. Like Trevithick, their early locomotives used a system where wheels gripped toothed rails by means of cogs, and this had a limited effect on the speed of the locomotives, but they proved a success nevertheless. Around 1811, Murray and Blenkinsop made significant improvements to the locomotive boilers, and one of their locomotives operated on the Kenton and Coxlodge Colliery, where it was seen by George Stephenson. The four most prominent early railway locomotive pioneers on Tyneside itself were Timothy Hackworth, William Headley, Nicholas Wood, and of course George Stephenson, all associated in some way with the colliery at Wylam on Tyne. which was the birthplace of Stephenson and Hackworth. Headley was born at nearby Newburn and Wood at Ryton-on-Tyne. William Headley had a strong conviction that locomotives could work without the cogs and teeth to grip the railway lines. And in 1813, he built the famous pioneering locomotive, the Puffing Billy, and then Wylam Dilly locomotives for hauling coal to staiths at Leamington. George Stephenson's first locomotive was built in 1814 and was called the Blucher, after a Prussian general. Hackworth, who assisted Headley in building the Puffing Billy, would make his name at Shildon in County Durham, establishing a locomotive works there and assisting George and Robert Stephenson with the making of the famous Locomotion No. 1. I think we have an image of that. Yeah, this is the locomotion at the Locomotion Museum in Shildon. And this was the locomotive used on the famous Stockton and Darlington Railway of 1825. Hackworth would also develop a locomotive of his own called the Royal George and another one called the Sans Pareil. We have an image of that. This is the replica at Locomotion Museum. And this competed against Robert Stephenson's Rocket at the Rainhill Trials. It had been the favourite to win, apparently, if it not for the boiler having cracked, one of the cylinders having cracked. Stephenson, however, George Stephenson, was the towering giant of northeast locomotive engineering. He worked at Killingworth Colliery and he resided in a cottage at Westmoor near Killingworth, to the rear of which he built his first locomotive. The sundial you see here on the front of the cottage was the creation of Stephenson himself. It's a beautiful little building. By 1819, the invention of malleable iron rails at Bedlington by John Birkinshaw in Northumberland really helped to launch the railway era in practical terms. And in 1822, the first ever railway built specifically for use by locomotives without the need for animals was constructed by Stephenson at Hetton Colliery, and it ran for 8 miles. George Stephenson was equally well known, of course, as Andrew has mentioned, at least in the Northeast, for the invention of a miner's safety lamp, which he developed in 1815. I think we have an image of some of the lamps there. The one on the left is Humphrey Davy's, and the cover and the lamp on the right are George Stephenson's. The need for a safety lamp was a necessity because of the explosions caused by the buildup of gases in the mines. The naked filament in the lamps would cause an explosion, and many thousands of miners died as a result of such explosions. Stephenson demonstrated his lamp a month before Sir Humphrey Davy demonstrated his perhaps better known lamp, and Davy, who was scientifically trained and educated, unlike the self-taught Stephenson, could not accept that Stephenson had independently developed a lamp of his own invention. Stephenson, sadly, was not initially credited for developing the lamp, and when he finally did gain official credit, he was awarded only half the prize money of what Davy had received. Davy's lamp was adopted across the country, but Stephenson's Geordie lamp, as it came to be known, was almost universally adopted in the northeast mines, and is said to be one of the reasons why northeast miners were known as Geordies in the 19th century, and particularly those of Tyneside. Working closely with George Stephenson on his railway projects, such as the building of Locomotion No. 1 and the surveying of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, was George's equally famous son, Robert Stephenson. Robert Stephenson would become a famous engineer in his own right, and like his father was a locomotive engineer, but he is particularly remembered in the field of civil engineering, where his only real rival was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. In the northeast, Stephenson is principally known for the building of the High Level Bridge at Newcastle and the Royal Border Bridge in Berwick-upon-Tweed. He is buried in Westminster Abbey. However, perhaps the biggest and most industrious name in the history of northeast industry is Sir William Armstrong. He was born in Shieldfield, Newcastle, and as a young man, he trained as a solicitor, but his real passions lay elsewhere. As an engineer, Scientist, inventor, and businessman, he became the region's foremost industrialist. He was the pioneering inventor of a piston engine, a new kind of hydraulic crane, a rotary engine, and much else. But he also had a key eye for business too. After purchasing land for the establishment of a works at Elzig on Tyne for the manufacture of cranes, he turned his attention to armaments, developing a breech-loading gun. In the American Civil War, he would supply both sides with armaments. The stone-built arched Tyne Bridge at Newcastle was replaced in 1876 by Armstrong's Swing Bridge, which enabled warships to head upstream to reach his Elzig works, where they could be fitted with guns. Armstrong's Elzig works, the Armstrong factory, as mentioned in the Bladen Racers anthem, stretched for almost a mile along the River Tyne and was a major employer that brought about the development of the Elzig suburb. In the 1880s, Armstrong's company merged with the shipbuilding firm of Charles Mitchell, an Aberdeen engineer who had established a shipyard at Walker on Tyne. From 1884, warships were built at Elzig. In the 1890s, the firm merged with a rival engine company, with a rival engineering company to become Armstrong Whitworth Engineering. Armstrong was a significant philanthropist as well as a businessman, and in this respect is perhaps best known for donating his home and grounds at Jesmond Dean to the people of Newcastle in 1883. Interestingly, Armstrong was the owner of the magnificent Bamborough Castle in Northumberland, which he extensively restored. But his primary home after his departure from Jesmond was the grand mansion house of Cragside in the hills above Rothbury in Northumberland. Of course, Cragside has magnificently landscaped grounds, which Armstrong had a major part in developing. Under Armstrong's supervision, Cragside became the first house in the world to be lit by hydroelectricity, using the lakes created in the landscaped grounds. The electric lighting itself, a brand new phenomenon, was provided by its northeast inventor, Joseph Wilson Swan. That's a great picture of him there at work. I hope everyone's okay. I hope everyone's following this. I hope I'm not talking too fast.
It's great.
Now, Sir Joseph Wilson Swan is one of the biggest names in the pioneering development of electric light and should perhaps be better known outside the region. In fact, he should be better known across the world. Born in Sunderland, he worked as a chemist in Newcastle and later became the inventor of the incandescent electric lamp, which is arguably the world's first light bulb. The primary problem in its development had been the creation of a vacuum for the removal of oxygen within the glass. This prevented the filament igniting and causing a fire. Swan had been working on this project and problem since the 1850s and successfully developed a practical lamp by 1878. However, a demonstration at the Newcastle Chemical Society in December of that year was short-lived as the light bulb burnt out after only a few minutes. A more successful demonstration took place at Sunderland's Athenaeum in January 1879, followed by a well-attended demonstration the following month at Newcastle's Literary and Philosophical Society in the presence of William Armstrong. Should say something very quickly about this building here. This was the centre where many of our great bright sparks in the region would meet to discuss their inventions and ideas. The Lytton Phil, really a really important building in the history of the modern world and in inventions that led to the development of our modern times. Now, Joseph Swan lived in Gateshead, and his house, which is called Underhill, is where he lived from 1869 to 1883. It's now a care home, but you can see there's a plaque there on the left which recalls his presence. This house in the Low Fell area of Gateshead would be lit by electric light. It was the first house in the world to be lit by electric light. Remember, we mentioned Cragside being the first house to be lit by light powered by hydroelectricity. Mosley Street in Newcastle was the first street in the world lit by electricity in February 1879. And in 1881, Benwell in the western suburbs of Newcastle became the site of the world's first light bulb factory. Swan and the American inventor Thomas Edison both patented a successful working incandescent lamp in 1880, with their developments taking place independently. But sadly, it is nearly always Edison that gets the credit for the development of the lamp. In 1883, the companies of Swan and Edison merged to form the Edison and Swan United Electric Light Company, or Ediswan for short. Their development of electric light would change the world. In addition to his electric light invention, Swan was an important pioneer in the development of photographic processes. His developments enabled photography to become a practical pastime for the first time, used by the masses. We should also note that Swan followed in the footsteps of his forebear, George Stephenson, in developing a miner's safety lamp. His lamp, of course, being electric. Joseph Swan wasn't the only major figure in electrical developments across the northeast of England. John Henry Holmes, a Newcastle electrical engineer, invented the first practical switch, electrical switch, a quick break switch as it was known. He first manufactured his switches at a motor and dynamo business in Shieldfield, Newcastle, from 1884. And all modern day wall-mounted light switches are still based on the principle of his invention. This is a plaque here in Mosley Street in Newcastle, which recalls the work of Joseph Swan in that particular street. The other big name in electrical developments on Tyneside and across Britain in general was the Newcastle-born electrical engineer Charles Hesterman Mears, known as the Grid King. This is him here. He was the son of a German chemist who resided on Tyneside. Mears pioneered the use of three-phase AC power distribution in the UK. His power station at Wallsend was the first three-phase electricity supply system in Britain. Most significantly, Mears lobbied Parliament to standardise voltages and frequencies across Britain, and he brought about the establishment of the national grid. He also pioneered the electrification of Britain's railways and established electric trams in cities such as Newcastle, Cork in Ireland, and Melbourne in Australia. He was the nephew on his mother's side of the Tyneside shipbuilder, John Wigham Richardson. Now, we've noted that Sir Joseph Swan was a chemist and that Mears was the son of a chemist. Humble chemists and major industrialists associated with the chemical industry were also found amongst the region's bright sparks of times past. Some surprising, if modest, inventions associated with chemists and chemistry include the development of the familiar household cleaner, Domestos. Domestos was developed by a Newcastle dental mechanic and chemist called William Handley in his garden shed at Byker in 1929. He purchased sodium hypochlorite from the chemical works at Billingham on Teesside for his invention. It was subsequently sold door to door by salesmen to the housewives of the day. Another modest invention that was developed by a Newcastle chemist was Lucozade, which was invented in 1927 by a chemist called William Owen. Owen's business was based in Newcastle's Barras Bridge, and he originally called the drink Glucozade. It was intended to help people recovering from colds and flu. It was rebranded as Lucozade in 1929. We might also mention the developments of Thomas Bell, a grocer rather than a chemist, who developed the world's first self-raising flour. Bell set up a grocery and tea company in his home village of Long Horsley in Northumberland in 1875, but he later moved it to the Groat Market in Newcastle. Without any royal permission, he called his business Bell's Royal Flour, but in the 1890s, this name was shortened to the more familiar Biro. The business later moved to Nottingham and then subsequently to St Albans, but its birthplace was Newcastle. Although the American food production and detergent company Procter & Gamble has an important presence in the northeast of England, the chemical industry itself in the region today is primarily associated with Teesside, where we find the massive chemical industry complexes at Billingham and at Wilton near Redcar. However, during the 19th century, Tyneside and Wearside were also major centres for the region's chemical industry, with products such as soaps, dyes, and bleach increasingly in demand. In 1798, a man called John Losh took out a lease on a rich supply of brine pumped from Walker Pit, and the salt from the mine was later used in the manufacture of alkali. Losh, Wilson and Bell established alkali works at Walker-on-Tyne in 1807 and manufactured bleaching powder from 1830. Soon they were making half the soda in England in Newcastle and Tyneside. Other alkali works opened in the 1820s and 1830s at Felling, at Tynedock, Fellingshaw, and the intriguingly named Friar's Goose near Gateshead, where there was a chimney erected in 1833, which was the largest chimney in England. It was used to disperse the fumes from the industry. This was back in the days before the Alkali Act of 1863 reduced pollution. The abundance of sand, lime, alkali, and salt in the region stimulated another chemical industry of sorts, the making of glass. Glass had been manufactured in the region since the days of Bede and appeared in the monasteries at Wearmouth and Jarrow. An interesting reminder of the industry is the huge cone-shaped building at Leamington to the west of Newcastle. This was part of the Leamington Glass Works and dates from the late 1700s. The industry that developed in the 19th century included industrialists and expertise which came from outside the region. Most notable in this regard were the Scots. Lots of Scottish industrialists and Scottish workers had an impact in the region. The big name in shipbuilding at Hebburn, for example, was Andrew Leslie, the son of a Scottish crofter from Shetland. I think we have an image of the river there, looking from Wallsend across to Hebburn with the cranes in the distance. Leslie grew up in Aberdeen, but sought his fortune on Tyneside, where he purchased land at Hebburn, where he established his shipyard. He supplemented his Tyneside workforce with labourers from Scotland, and Hebburn soon came to be known as Little Aberdeen. There was also an important Irish workforce in his shipyard. Leslie's works later merged with the company of locomotive makers called R.W. Hawthorne of St. Peter's in Newcastle, and they became the engineering firm of Hawthorne Leslie. Later, they were acquired by Swan Hunter, but Leslie's Hebburn yard, his shipyard, continued building ships until 1982. Now, as well as Scots, other Europeans could also be found within the ranks of the Tyneside industrialists. They included the Danish chemical manufacturer Christian Allison, who operated a soap works in Gateshead. Allison later went into a partnership with a German called Henry Bolko. I think we have an image of him. Now, Bolko himself had arrived on Tyneside at the invitation of Newcastle's Walkergate ironmaster John Vaughan, and he came as an investor. Bolko and Vaughan would later go on to establish the ironworks at Middlesbrough, where they became the great ironmasters and the most influential industrialists in that brand new town's history. Bolko himself would go on to become Middlesbrough's first mayor and later its first MP. But his industrial connections to the northeast began on Tyneside. The age of iron had its impact on Tyneside. There were ironworks at Bedlington, Tudhoe, Spennymoor, Concert, Towlaw, and others across the north. Now, iron demanded the use of coking coal, and the railway and civil engineering industries demanded iron, so that all these industries were interconnected. By the middle of the century, wooden ships were also beginning to be replaced by iron ones, so that became a new centre of demand for the production of iron. Losh, Wilson and Bell erected blast furnaces at Walker around 1842, utilising iron from the Whitby area. Shipbuilding, as we have already mentioned, has a long history in the region. Newcastle, I think we should have a look at that image again, that lovely image from the 1700s of Newcastle, if we can, Jack. Yeah, just back a little bit. That's the one. Yeah, this lovely. This has got pride of place on. Just a little bit of a side. This has got pride of place in my living room. This a framed image of this. This is Nathaniel Buck's engraving of Newcastle upon Tyne in the 1700s, around about 1740, I think it is. And you can see the Tyne Bridge there. With all the buildings going across it. You can see St Nicholas Church, now Newcastle Cathedral. You can see the Castle Keep just in front of it. It's a wonderful picture. This is only part of it. It's only part of that image. And it just shows you how bustling Newcastle was. You can see the quayside with sailing ships alongside. And you can see the keel boats as well, with the men on board, the boats with the oar, and there's a man steering at the rear. And these are the boats that were used in the transportation of coal. Shipbuilding, of course, was important in Newcastle for a long time. Newcastle was recorded as building a galley for the King's Fleet as early as 1294, with ships built at Sunderland from at least 1346 and at Stockton-on-Tees from at least 1470. And there was also shipbuilding at Hartlepool. These, of course, as I say, were wooden sailing ships. And the collier ships, which transported coal by sea, were of paramount importance to the region's economy. The South Shields-born Charles Mark Palmer, who established a shipyard at Jarrow in 1851, built its first collier, the John Bowes, in 1852. That's Charles Mark Palmer there. And I think we also have an image of the John Bowes being launched at Jarrow. That's the one. You can see it at the centre of the picture. And this was the first ever seagoing screw collier. It was an iron collier. That's another important aspect of it. It was built of iron. And it was the first ever seagoing screw collier. And it was built for powerful coal owner John Bowes, whom it's named after. And it really speeded up the process of delivering coal to London. This was quite important because there was a bit of a threat that the coal fields of the Midlands might start to compete with the coal field up in the northeast. So it was really important that they could ship coal by sea as quickly as they possibly could to London. Palmer's also built the first rolled armour plate for warships in the year 1854. In 1886, the shipyard of Armstrong and Mitchell, they launched the Gluckhauf, I think that's how you pronounce it, which was arguably the world's first oil tanker ship. However, the biggest name in northeast shipbuilding was the firm of Swan Hunter. Its story begins with the Scotsman Charles Mitchell, who we have already mentioned. But Mitchell, who operated a shipyard at Walker, opened a brand new yard at Wallsend in 1873. The intention was that this would cope with the excess orders. But sadly for Mitchell, the Wallsend yard failed financially. However, the yard was handed over to Mitchell's brother-in-law, Charles Swan. In 1878, Charles arranged a partnership with a Sunderland shipbuilder, George Hunter, who became managing director, that's George Hunter there, after Swan's untimely death in 1879. Swan Hunter built their first steel ship at Wallsend in 1884, and they built their first oil tanker in 1889. In 1898, they built their first ocean liner, the Ultonia, and a further 21 of these ocean liners would follow, including the famous Mauretania, story of which has been covered so beautifully by Andrew. This transatlantic ocean liner was launched in 1906, and it carried 2,000 passengers on its maiden voyage and held the Blue Ribbon Award for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic for 22 years. The industrial importance of the region was no more apparent than in the First World War. Great demand for Northeast industrial products, such as armaments and ships, became an important feature of the Northeast economy. There was demand for Armstrong Whitworth at Elswick, Hawthorne Leslie, and for Palmer's at Jarrow. After the war, coal mining had reached its peak in the region by 1923, but hard times came in the 20s and 30s, and it was clear that the war had only brought a temporary industrial boost. Recession in the 1920s and the Wall Street crash of 1929 added to the woes of the Northeast economy. Industries and mines continued to close, unemployment rose. In desperate times, the Jarrow March of 1936 exemplified these troubles. The Second World War brought another temporary boost to the Northeast industry, of course, but throughout the later 20th century, the region increasingly had to reinvent itself with new roles and new kinds of employment and a whole new sense of itself and identity. Perhaps one of the ways in which it has done this is through the role of culture and creativity. Theatre, arts, television, music, and movies have all played their part, with many of the region's brightest sparks of the recent ages being writers, musicians, artists, actors, movie directors, and presenters. We can think of people like Sting or Mark Knopfler or the movie director Ridley Scott. This tradition of creativity had a long history. We can think of the Lindisfarne Gospels, the artistic achievements of Northumbria. We can also think of the folk music and the music hall creations of more modern times, the 19th century. The Blaydon Racers and the music of Joe Wilson. So there was a strong sense of identity which developed in the 19th century culturally and through creativity and music. But this continued into modern times, and it still does today. You can think of people like Anton Deck, who are obviously great ambassadors for the region. And a lot of these people remember the region's past with pride, and they're very proud of their connection to the region. And they often have an understanding of it, drawing from it their roots and experience in their cultural creativity. This is quite apparent in some of the music of Sting or Mark Knopfler, and in some of the writers that have made the region famous. Now, of course, it is through these bright sparks of modern time that the people of the Northeast will continue to shine, and long may that continue. I hope you've enjoyed this sort of little ride through the famous people, the bright sparks of Northeast industry. And thank you very much, Andrew, for inviting me to do this.
That was wonderful, David. I've just written so many notes. It was just a fantastic. You went into such brilliant detail, stuff that I never heard of. The journey of steam engines in detail, and the details of how the electricity and the national grid. And I couldn't believe it when you're talking about Domestos and Lucasade and self-raising flour. I was like, no.
I love those things, yes.
Yeah, they're brilliant. But these are all important things. Just fantastic. So, well, I don't know whether T1 are going to be able to create a transcript of this, David. I suspect they might be able to run something off to sit alongside the recording, but certainly there will be captions for what you've been describing Brilliant. And talking about, so the teachers can follow that afterwards.
Great.
I'm just going to throw open now. We've got a few minutes left. If anyone has any questions, please do come forward to talk to and ask David. I know it's the end of a long teaching day for you all. No, okie dokie. Right. Well, that remains to me to say thank you very much, David. Again, it's been an absolute pleasure you contributing and getting to know you and work with you. And don't forget, England's North East website, and I think we'll get that to the teachers after the event in some kind of.
That would be brilliant. Yeah, and I think that website, as I say, it includes a timeline, some sections on famous people. These run to several pages, but there are also sections on resources for history. And books as well. There's a whole section with literally hundreds of books about the North East, and a whole section with literally a list of hundreds of wonderful resources that can be used for exploring North East history and institutions as well.
Yeah, I kept jumping in and out of it when I was doing my research, David. I found it really useful, and you go into such detail as you've done here on the website in the different areas. So yes, check that out. Don't forget the next events, which will be sent to you shortly, which Jack has just popped into the chat bar there. So thanks very much, everyone. Safe journey home, and see you all soon.